Until I knew it firsthand, it was an idea. And then when it was no longer an idea, it was obvious. And it was like, oh, so that's when the sages say, I am that, the collapse of subject and object, this is what they're talking about. And it actually feels completely natural and obvious once it happens.
When did you first discover spirituality, and how did it influence your journey into psychotherapy?
I was raised as an Episcopalian, Church of England, American version, and was an acolyte, altar boy, and my mother was religious, my father was not. So I regularly attended church until my mid-teens. So religious, but I wouldn't call that spiritual. And then at the same time, quite mysteriously, in late boyhood, and this would be probably age 11, 12, often when I would start falling asleep at night, I would enter into a kind of hypnagogic state. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't fully awake. It felt like my body was expanding infinitely. It would become infinitely large and infinitely small and infinitely large and infinite. It was just this kind of waxing and waning. Interestingly, the sense of becoming infinitely small was the same as infinitely large. And there was a corresponding imagery of a tightrope walker just moving from one end of a pole to another as this would happen. All of this quite spontaneously and unexpectedly, none of which I understood, none of which I shared with anyone. And yet it was mildly ecstatic, I would say. Just this sense of vast space, either tiny or huge. And then puberty hit, and it was all forgotten. Now, I would say, looking back, that was the beginning of some kind of conscious spiritual life, but I wouldn't have framed it that way. And then I began the practice of transcendental meditation when I was 20. I was a student at the University of California. And the second time I sat in meditation, that sense of infinite space opened again. And it was like, oh, here it is. And I'd totally forgotten about it. So that time there was a frame of spiritual understanding, because I'd been reading in the Indian tradition in Vedanta probably since I was 18. I read Yogananda, Ramakrishna, the yogic tradition, and other books, theosophical books and so on. So some Western mystical traditions. So at that point, there was an intellectual understanding that this was a spiritual experience. Before, there was no conceptual framework for that. I would say that was the beginning of my quest, if you will.
And how would you distinguish between spirituality and religion in your own way?
I would say religion is a system of beliefs and practices, and very often involves a community. One would recite the Nicene Creed, these things I believe. One would go to church. It remained on a conceptual level and on a social level, but it did not speak to essence. And so I would make that distinction. Spirituality is about essence, being, and religion is practices and beliefs that are intended to support the discovery of that, but very often actually obstruct it.
One way of thinking about it that I like is the idea that religion's more prescriptive in terms of giving you a way to think about things, whereas spirituality is more trying to describe the nature of what it is to be in the world.
That I would agree with in part, but I would say the essence of spirituality is beyond prescription or description, right? And that the point of the description, first of all, is not to offer a conceptual framework, but actually have a pointer to introduce and invite, more specifically, those who are so inclined to have the taste for themselves. And so when the description is non-conceptual, that is when we're not speaking about, but speaking from, in particular, then it has potency. And that is the essence, I would say, of any true spiritual tradition. And it wasn't until, there were different teachers, but I would say the person who I first got that flavor from directly was Nisargadatta Maharaj. I read his book, I Am That, and it was so just vibrant. The lectures, the talks, they weren't lectures, they were talks, dialogues were so vibrant with that knowing of pure consciousness. it resonated and I felt it. But the first person I really experienced that sense of presence with in person was Jean Klein, the European Advaita sage. And it was with him that I studied for 12 years until he retired. And so I would say he was really my foundational spiritual teacher. And after he passed, my second teacher, who had, in my experience, the same presence, the same vibrant presence from which he spoke about, and from this was Adyashanti.
So then how did you become interested in psychotherapy?
I was a law student at the University of California in San Francisco. I was really unhappy. I could do it. I was a good student, law student, but it didn't really appeal to me. And so one night, I was living in downtown San Francisco in a little apartment. I had my little meditation altar and space set up in my closet. And I would sit every morning and evening. And one night, I was actually pretty desperate. And I remember in my meditation just, in a way, praying, kind of calling out for a sign. It wasn't to a personal God, but to some higher power. Please give me a sign of what my work should be, what career to take. And that night, I had a dream, and there was a billboard, speaking about a sign, a huge billboard with lights all around it, with the name of the graduate school that I eventually went to, the California Institute of Asian Studies. And it was just like going, CIAS, CIAS. Like, that was a pretty clear sign. So this is a transpersonally oriented graduate school. So I took a leave of absence from law school. I went to India for the summer. I came back and I entered this school, basically following it as an inner guide. And that took me into studying psychology. I wanted to make a living, but I wanted to make a living in a way, first of all, that was congruent with my spiritual unfolding. And second of all, that would be of service to others. There were mixed motives in doing that, but it felt like, I was trying to thread some kind of needle.
When you said spiritual unfolding, and when we talk about spiritual awakening in general, what exactly are we talking about?
We're talking about the conscious recognition of our true nature. How about you? You want to take a stab at that question?
I think in my journey, it was that at the beginning, the invitation was to ask the questions, who am I? And what is the nature of my subjective experience? And that led me into a self-inquiry that produced answers that I can't describe in words. Maybe spiritual awakening is kind of being awake to that knowledge that we can't share with others directly, but we can embody and point to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That resonates for me. And particularly, it can't be completely articulated. It can be pointed to. It can be expressed, through words and non-verbally. It can be felt, though, can it? And in that feeling, in that felt sense, in that knowing, communication of the knowing, we recognize that it's shared, right? And I can feel that in you as you speak of it, that it's non-conceptual. It's prior to concept. One can use concepts to point to it and speak about it, but it's prior to that, fundamentally. I remember in my late 20s, I read Ramana Maharshi's book, a book about Ramana called Self-Inquiry, and there was I was quite taken with his photo, just looking into those eyes. I'm going to get a photo, one you're certainly familiar with, and I just show it for your viewers, though. And those eyes, are just remarkable. And I just fell into them, so I knew that this was someone who knew. But when I read the book and I tried his self-inquiry practice, I did it from the level of the mind. I did it as kind of repeating, who am I? Who am I? And, I would try affirming, I am consciousness, I am pure. None of it was very helpful because I was naive and I didn't understand really that it was not meant to be a mental, even though I read that it was not meant to be a mental. I didn't understand that. And so actually it wasn't until I had that experience with Nisargadatta that self-inquiry really came online for me. a few years later. Meeting Maharaj and reading I Am That really created a 180 shift, away from subtle trying to understand or get something, and realize that the one who is perceiving, the one who is asking, is what is being looked for. But even with that intuition, it took a while for that to unfold with real clarity. Even though there were glimpses, very often those were obscured by conditioning. And it's taken some time, actually, for that recognition to penetrate the conditioned mind, the conditioned heart, the conditioned gut. And of course, that's, been a lot of what, my teaching and sharing has been about.
I feel as though one of the things that is difficult for people coming to spirituality is that invitation to go beyond the mind, because for them that sounds very frustrating, as if you're giving them a box full of air, and they're trying to open something they can't latch onto, they can't grasp.
Can't grasp. It's ungraspable. And they think that that's a failure. And one of the interesting insights is for people to begin to realize that it's not a failure, that not knowing is actually an important step to relax into. And that the mind, beautiful, powerful tool that it is, cannot grasp its source. How important it is for the mind to see its limits is true. Many people find that very frustrating and challenging. And yet it is so liberating and so important on the spiritual quest for us to recognize both the beauty and the value of the mind, not to dismiss it, not to negate it, not to fight with it, not to understand it has its absolutely vital function in our human practical life. By its nature, it cannot grasp its source, that who we are is not an object, not a thing. Very interesting, because we identify. It's such a tendency to take ourselves as something, to define ourselves, to identify. And so to actually begin the process of disidentification is challenging and profoundly liberating, as you know.
How would you describe the changes that you underwent in terms of your moment-to-moment experience of life as these realizations set in?
What would happen is, I would say, there were many small openings, in which glimpses we might call, in which there would be moments in which I just couldn't define myself. And there was just a sense of openness. These would be more with quiet sitting or on retreat or with Jean Klein, for instance. There would just be, openness to presence. There was a sense of homecoming. It's like, yes, I know this is true. And yet very often they were temporary. And I would find myself, leaving a particular environment, time with a teacher, on retreat, in meditation, entering into ordinary life. And there the shifts were more subtle. In other words, there was a feeling of being released from a default mode at points, and then the recurrence, the recrystallization of the default mode and an ordinary sense of self. And that went on for many years, actually. And very gradually. And so what I noticed in my ordinary life was just more and more a sense of being at ease, I would say. An inner sense of peace, an inner sense of openness. But still, as I would describe it sometimes to friends, it felt like there was a kind of slight haze, like a ceiling. I knew true nature, but it wasn't my ordinary experience. I was functioning as a kind of lightly identified human being for many years. And so that was kind of a period more progressive, kind of gradual. And then there was a fairly dramatic shift. There was one fairly sustained glimpse when I was with Jean Klein, and that lasted, part of a day. And I was with Jean on retreat, and he recognized what had happened. But it wasn't until I met Adyashanti and went on retreat with him, and there was a real shift that happened in a clear breaking of the ceiling, I would say, clearing of that subtle fog of individual identity. And it felt like the mind was freed. It's like it just didn't go back. There was no longer that sense of identifying with being an individual entity with a story, with an image. So there was a sense really of sustained inner freedom. That was on my first small retreat with Adyashanti. And then that transposed 2 years later to a sense of openness, awakening of the heart, two kind of steps with the heart. One, a recognition of the wholeness of the perceiver, not just the infinite nature, which is on a more mental level, sense of vast space, but really a sense of, on a feeling level. It was interesting. It was on a different level of recognizing wholeness here, and then that matured into a sense of realizing non-separateness, that, perceiver and perceived are not different, that what we call the world is myself. I could differentiate on a practical level, but on an inner feeling level, there was a feeling of just it's all one thing. It's all consciousness. And then that's continued to deepen into the guts, into the pelvis and solar plexus and pelvis and into the deep ground. So that's been the process of embodiment.
So when you say you became synonymous with the world, how could you explain to someone who feels very much like a contracted individual person what that means?
This is something we could both give a try for therapy, because it's so hard to put into words. So ordinarily, we take ourselves as a separate localized being. We imagine that we are in this body. This is my body. I'm in here and you're out there. Not only are you out there, but it is out there. And that is the ordinary experience and the consensual experience of 99.9% of human beings. And it's actually developmental. Anyone with ordinary nervous system is going to have that experience of being a separate entity who's localized somewhere in their body. What happens is you discover that's not true. That the apparent perceiver is not local, is not confined or contained within the body, is actually open, infinite space. Now, initially, for many people, that feels like the perceiver, that subjectivity then just completely opens up, but there can still be a sense of a subtle otherness or of a world, like an infinite perceiver and a finite world. So it's like, I'm infinite awareness having a finite experience. And that was briefly, that for maybe 2 years, there was that subtle duality that I realized was still happening. Then there was a realization, and this was kind of completely unexpected and truly awesome and jaw-dropping in its revelatory power, was the recognition that this which is looking out is the same as that which is being looked at. So this whole distinction of self and world, even infinite self and finite world, collapsed. And it's like, it's all one thing. It's all consciousness. Consciousness looking out and seeing itself. Formless consciousness looking out and seeing itself as formed consciousness. Emptiness, form, same thing, same non-thing. But until one has that experience, you can't describe it. Until I knew it firsthand, it was an idea. And then when it was no longer an idea, it was obvious. And it was like, oh, so that's when the sages say, Tat Tvamasi, I am that, this is that, the collapse of subject and object. This is what they're talking about. And it actually feels completely natural and obvious once it happens. So how about you?
What you just said reminded me of a quote, which is, when the one who sees collapses into what is seen, who do we become?
Yes. Yeah. It's posed as a question. Mm-hmm. And it is a collapse. It's a collapse of an apparent duality, of the apparent subject-object, of apparent perceiver-perceived. And now you're intimate with life. Even as ordinary life unfolds, and, we have our ordinary bodily needs and desires and relationships and navigating ordinary society, still there's an inner freedom, the truest meaning of love, too. There are many levels of love and kinds of love, but this is really the essence of love, the knowing of our oneness or non-separateness with the totality of life. Heart's yearning, I would say, for the beloved, for God to be at rest, all of that is actualized in this understanding.
But I think the heart longs for the end of separation. It was once whole, and now you're in this apparent world of multiplicity as this contracted, separate self that's longing to come home to itself and return to the thing that it knows but can't quite put its finger on.
And what's interesting about that, I completely agree, is having lost conscious awareness of that, there is a deep, unnameable grief and yearning for return. And very often in the field of psychotherapy, this is not understood or recognized. And it's been very interesting working with people, kind of making this more practical and how does this impact psychology. When we know this ourselves as a therapist, as a helper, as a coach, we know the depths of the heart and the truth of what you're describing, Harry. First of all, we sense that in the other. We know that's true in the other as well. We don't even need to name it. We just recognize it. If it's recognized here, it's recognized to be true for everyone. It doesn't make you special, It doesn't make you higher or better. It lets you in on what's an essential knowing and what you know is true for everyone. And therefore, sitting with someone else, it's true for them. And so as they begin in their inner search for some sense of well-being, maybe relief from suffering, but also a sense of well-being, you can begin to sense when they're beginning to home in on this and encourage them to keep going or begin to name it or describe it in ways that make sense to them. And one of the ways you can do that is when they experience grief and they don't know what it's about. Like, I just feel this sense of grief, and what is it? Is it, do I miss this? Do I miss that? Is it because my mother or father died or whatever? And you can sense, well, there is grief for that when it happens, but this is another category of grief or experience. And so too with desire and yearning. It's like, what is the deepest desire, right? What is the deepest desire? It's for the revelation of true nature. And so for someone who's working in psychology as a helper, to have this dimension available to them, not as a concept, but as a lived reality, is a beautiful invitation for the one who is discovering this themselves, support and invitation to deepen in that intimacy.
It's interesting that you talk about grief and how it would feel to be relieved of that. Because one of the overwhelming feelings that came through for me when I had my experience, which I can talk about, is the feeling of relief, as well as gratitude, as well as outpouring love. But it was a very deep relief, like, of course, or it was the setting down the heavy suitcase that I've been carrying my whole life.
Yes. Yeah. Profound relief. That's right. Deeply at rest in as being itself. Nameless being.
And as you described, there's a real sense of intimacy to life. And one way I've thought about it now is it's like in that moment or in that experience, I discovered a relationship and fell in love, but not with the person, with life itself.
The awakening of the heart, which is so celebrated, right? In our songs and our stories and romantic love. And yet always, at some point there's disappointment that the other is not filling our image of who they should be. Right? The honeymoon ends. But in this case, the honeymoon doesn't end, right? The marriage is secure.
I feel as though a lot of people come across this idea of awareness or consciousness, and they can discover that and get to know that part of themselves through meditation. And they can also know what it's like to be with themselves between the thoughts when they're not in the identity of the separate self. People kind of get that. That next stage is the movement towards identifying with everything else. The feeling is that there's awareness perceiving content. But actually, if you search for a boundary between awareness itself and the contents of awareness, you don't find it. As far as your direct experience goes, it's one seamless, vast expanse of pure creative intelligence of which you have a pinpoint view of.
Well said. Yeah, beautifully said.
So just moving on to talk about psychotherapy more specifically, one of the questions that I've had in terms of my own practice is how can that recognition of my true nature be deployed in service of someone else in a therapeutic context?
Part of it depends on what the agreement is between therapist and client and what the interest of the client is. So the frame is actually very important. And if the frame is fairly conventional in terms of, let's say, symptomatic relief of, say, anxiety and depression, and having someone to talk to and sort out one's experience, this understanding that we're speaking of tends to be more in the background. It comes across as a sense of openness and empathy and attunement and a general supportive presence to someone's unfolding. If it is tried to be introduced or named explicitly, usually it's not understood or welcomed. It remains more in the background, as a way of being, I would say. And one way that it affects is we come in in the role of so-called therapist or helper, actually without any agenda. We're just listening. We're not even a listener. We're not even holding space, which is how it's conventionally understood. I hold space for you to have your experience. It's like, no one's holding space. No one's listening. Just listening, happening. Listening, attuning, spontaneous reflection, response. There's a certain purity that is in the field, but it's implicit rather than explicit. Now, if someone knows, and if you have either word of mouth spreads or you present yourself as having a presence-based therapy, even though I trained in a transpersonal program and I taught for 23 years, I instructed clinicians in a transpersonally oriented, I never took on the title of a transpersonal therapist because very often it would be associated with anomalous states of consciousness, special states induced by meditation or plant medicine or something, extraordinary states, unusual states. For me, that's much too narrow because what we're talking about is not a state. It's not something that comes and goes. We're talking about who we are fundamentally, our essential nature as openness, as being, as consciousness. So I would kind of leave my frame of definition very open and just say I do depth work. It's very experiential, very in the moment, and then, or very presence centered or presence based. So if you begin to present yourself in that way, you'll start attracting clients who are interested not only in symptomatic relief, but in self-knowledge, self-discovery. In other words, it shifts from, symptomatic relief to more existential exploration. Who am I? The question that you introduced. What is this? Who am I? What is my deepest nature? Who am I really? Now we have a different frame, a different contract, if you will. Someone comes in with that interest. Now this understanding can be more explicit. Like that can be included as part of the languaging and as part of the experience. That happened very quickly for me when I began private practice, is that I began to attract people who already were spiritual practitioners and they wanted to work with their conditioning. They were familiar with meditation. They were familiar with dropping in. They were familiar with opening up. And dropping in and opening up was flushing out all sorts of material. And it was also obscuring and obstructing stable access to this awareness. So that became the sweet spot of my working. It's like, okay, so we come in without an agenda to fix or change, just to be with what is arising and to be intimate with it and to be curious and to be affectionate and to welcome it rather than going into it with an agenda to fix or change, make it go away, get rid of it, much more to welcome it into presence, into awareness, and to inquire into the truth of any of our beliefs. And that became, a very explicit way of working with people. It was accepted. It was understood that this was, the modality. So I'll offer that as an introductory response to that question.
Are you able to share a story that illustrates the power of modeling that way of being to a client?
Here's a story of a woman who began coming to my retreats, and she'd come to retreats with other teachers for many years, actually for over 2 decades. Really fine teachers. But she always found that she couldn't drop in during meditation, and she asked if she could have an individual meeting with me. I do that exceptionally, and because she'd be coming to my retreats, I agreed to. So we sat, and she had a background and experience of trauma, severe trauma as a child. And so dropping in and letting go meant losing control. And that meant to her younger parts, a sense of tremendous unsafety. She was deeply drawn to the teaching, this teaching and understanding. She had an intuition of it, but she was afraid to really let go because of that, because of early material. And she was in therapy with someone else and had done a lot of excellent work using internal family systems and child parts. But what she didn't understand was this very young part that had been abused actually held the key to her opening. She had always seen it as a kind of obstruction, the fear. As I worked with this young part, kind of as she came into the foreground and we began, I could feel that not only was she wounded, but what was behind the wound. There was tremendous innocence and openness in this young part that had been shut down and had become very blockaded. And as we talked about her and with her, this young part, she began to realize, I have value, I have worth, I'm carrying something very important and very beautiful. So that was the first realization in the first meeting. The second meeting, she just dropped in and opened up, and it's like, the pathway opened. There was a realization it's safe now to open, and that I am not fundamentally wounded or flawed. So that particular theme, we are on human levels. We've been deeply impacted by our conditioning, particularly if we've had trauma, we've had difficult parenting, attachment issues or traumatic issues. We've learned this impacts the nervous system in a really deep way. Our sense of self, our sense of how we relate to others, how we work, our self-care, our sense of safety and openness in the world, our sense of ease, regardless of what our spiritual life is. This leaves a deep imprint on the nervous system and in the psyche. And people identify with that and say, okay, in my core, I'm wounded. In my core, I'm limited. And then I defend that and I compensate and I move through life with a sense of struggle. When they discover 2 things, one is that despite whatever conditioning I have, I am whole. I am complete. I am unwounded. I could never be wounded. This which I am. It's a tremendous revelation. It's like there's a relief, but not denying the conditioning, like not going into a flight of light, but saying both are true. In my humanity, I've been deeply hurt, and defended, and it's had many impacts. And in my core, I've never been wounded. And that allows this whole opening of that realization of essential nature that's unwounded. And also the realization that the wounded parts, if you're able to welcome them in the right spirit, of loving attention, begin to soften and open, and they discover their true nature too. Like they discover that. It's like, oh, I'm not a problem. I'm not an obstacle. In fact, I carry these essential qualities of being, of innocence, of playfulness, of openness, of love. This was her experience within a few meetings. And she was very mature and brought in a lot of resources. But there was a key understanding, that unfolded for her, that what she took to be an obstacle was actually a doorway. That misunderstanding had kept her process stuck for many, many years and had not been pointed out either by a therapist or a spiritual teacher. So it was this is where it gets very subtle, this relationship between healing and awakening, because they're complementary. And often I find in the field of psychology, even in transpersonal psychology, where there can be conceptual understanding of this wholeness, if there's not an experiential understanding, it remains abstract and doesn't have the same potency. So it's really important for a practitioner with a transpersonal or spiritual orientation to have a firsthand understanding. Or let's say, put it this way, the more it is firsthand, the more powerful it is. But very often, non-transpersonal programs, psychological programs and trainings and frameworks of understanding will dismiss or devalue the spiritual life as being avoidant and not to be trusted. And there's some truth in it, because people do go to spiritual life for some relief, from suffering, some way to transcend or get beyond it. So you'll often see in spiritual seekers this tendency to avoid experience and to try to achieve or attain a higher state. So there's some truth to that critique from the psychological side. From the spiritual side, from teachers and traditions will say, why are you messing around in that egoic mess? Give your attention to what is most real and most true, and it will take care of itself. There is some truth to that. There is a falling away. There is a healing. There is an opening that does spontaneously happen. And it doesn't touch everything. If you have a contemplatively oriented psychotherapist, someone who has their own deep practice and hopefully some degree of realization, they can work with someone in their conditioning in a way that understands this very subtle and complex interaction between conditioning and unconditioned openness.
I think it's really important what you just highlighted, and the need to hold the tension between, the earth and the heaven in a way, or you could call it the humanity and the spiritual life, because both have their place. And there is the risk of negligence or harm if someone essentially plasters over a crack with a plaster that says, I am whole.
Exactly. Well said. Yeah. So when that happens, and you see it a lot, you see it with spiritual teachers and students in spiritual gatherings, they can all get high together in a way, But often there's a lot of shadow material that gets acted out by the teacher and by senior students, and by students among themselves, because the teaching is, we don't go into that. It's not important. It's devalued. And so it remains in the shadows. And when it's in the shadows, it's acted out in terms of power, dynamics, sexual improprieties, in terms of money. These are the kind of three areas where spiritual teachers and communities get into so much trouble. And then it's deeply wounding to the students when that happens. And speaking to the harm now, like we trained as therapists, we understand how delicate and important the role of a therapist is with dealing the vulnerable human psyche. This is even more true when you're bringing in the spiritual dimension. Like you're going not only to tender levels of ego development, you're going to soul levels, and you're going to the essence, the universal level of consciousness. And if you're not coming in, with maturity and integrity, you can do a lot of harm. You're touching what's most sacred, most important in our humanity, which is that which we all share in common. So there's tremendous responsibility that comes with working with this, and it requires unusual maturity on the part of the practitioner.
Going to your book, one of the things I took away from it was this idea of contraction and release, and that getting more and more subtle on different levels. So physiological, psychological, and spiritual. How could you articulate the transcendence of those levels and, as a therapist, facilitate that movement in a client?
I've been very interested in what the process of resisting, of letting go on whatever level. Of course, that's spoken of, in terms of psychological defenses and analysis and interpretation. But on a subtle level, the sense of being a separate self is really quite complex and deep and has different levels to it. So there can be a release from that sense of separation on a mental level, on an emotional level. Much more dense and slower is the release on an instinctual level. And that outwardly is body identification, and I'm the doer, doership, individual doership, but above all, around issues of safety and security, because that's where very often awakenings and openings just very quickly, under challenging circumstances, become contraction. And we kind of go back to the default mode of survival. We can see that individually and collectively as human beings. We are wired this way. And so in my work with people, as they deepen in their spiritual unfolding, on these levels, and it's very subtle how these levels open and impact one another. Very often the core contraction is around issues of security and safety, both in terms of self-image and the body. And there is an energetic level to it that is a subtle somatic level of contraction. A core contraction is what I call it. And we identify with that core contraction. We unconsciously, largely unconsciously think, this is what I am, a contraction, because it feels that way. And if that contracted sense of self feels threatened, there's going to be a defense. But when there's an understanding that actually body-mind is waiting in a certain way for the optimal environment, whatever that may be, it'll be different for different individuals, for that contraction to release, it will start to. So being able to identify, that is to say, recognize, not identify, recognize that in our clients, like where they're contracting, where they're getting stuck, and then inviting attention to that, not to fix or change it, but to welcome it into presence. Okay, so you're feeling shaky. So you're feeling contracted. So you're feeling terrified. Many therapists will, let's resource you. Let's change the topic here. You're afraid of annihilation. Don't worry about it. We'll get you some resources and secure the individual sense of self. If someone has a deep knowing that there's the truth of who we are is beyond that contraction, they'll say, let's work with this, right? I know this territory. It's okay. Let's take it safely. Let's take it carefully. Let's welcome this into presence. Let's step back, open up, welcome. And then if the body shakes a little bit, to let it tremor. That's very common, I find. Sometimes just that welcoming allows a softening. Like we're no longer resisting the resistance. The welcoming of the resistance allows a natural unfolding. And very often it's important to question the core limiting belief that goes with it, which is, if I let go, I'll die. If I let go, I'll be annihilated. If I let go, I'll be nothing. That one's true. So there's kind of being able to sort out the confusion. No, body's not going to die, and I'm not going to become dysfunctional. But who I think I am, and who I feel I am, and who I sense I am ordinarily, that's going to release and let go. And I'm really opening to the unknown, and that's okay. That piece, of support, subtly and verbally, is very helpful in allowing a natural unfolding. Now, when people have had significant trauma to their system, this contraction will be stronger, right? And it will take more time, and there are layers, and it's good to know how to work with it. Good to know to take it slowly. Good to know how to resource, titrations, and pendulation from somatic experiencing is very helpful principles. Being able to tolerate it within yourself, like as a practitioner, as a helper. I find myself over many years saying a lot of what I do is my willingness to go to hell with my clients, to enter into their hell states with them and discover that it is a state and not the deepest truth of who they are. So yeah, this core contraction and this energetic contraction is a very important part, I find, in my work with almost everyone.
In life, generally, people are seeking relief from tension. And almost everything we do is a movement towards a more comfortable place. And that's instinctive. But sometimes moving towards that is much more difficult because of what you've just described, that we feel as if we do let go, it will overwhelm us. So I struggled with prolonged grief. And the feeling that came with that was that if I allowed that feeling to come through and overwhelm me, I wouldn't be able to handle it. So it was like an existential threat to go there. So I didn't. That Pandora's box was too dangerous. Even though I was seeking relief from that tension and the pain of the grief, and I knew what I needed to do, which was to grieve, to cry, it was too terrifying to open that box.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. And to have someone be with you and say, it's okay, right? You're not going to fall apart. You're not going to be dysfunctional. It could get uncomfortable temporarily. It can be disorienting temporarily. That's an important piece. It's like, that's why a lot of people don't go into psychotherapy, or if they go in, they stop at a certain level. They don't go more deeply.
And I think the important part of that is the person that says that it's okay, that you've built up enough trust to really believe them. Because it's easy for someone to sit there and say that you're safe here, just let it out. But you don't necessarily trust them yet.
Very important. Yeah, you need to build trust. What's interesting is you can actually build that pretty quickly. If you're attuned with someone and they feel like, oh, I'm being seen and heard, and you're authentic in your being, you're not hiding behind some role. You're just very much there. You're in a role as a helper, but you're not hiding behind it. It's held lightly. And they feel your presence, and they feel your care, and they feel the accuracy of your perception and support. That trust can build actually quite quickly. But you're right. It's an important ingredient, and it is relational. And very often, a lot of our conditioning, a lot of our so-called wounding is relational in origin and led to distrust. So having that bond, often referred to as a therapeutic bond or the therapeutic relationship, is very important.
What would you say are some of the skills, the finer skills that you've developed later on in your career that were kind of hard-won ways of working?
Two things come to mind, and they're not so much, I would say, skills, as in one case, just an unfolding insight of trusting the unfolding of experience and not needing to manipulate it in any way.
So in a way, that's you letting go of something.
Exactly. Having to perform, having to produce something of value, doing it right. There's what we would call an environmental press. Someone comes to meet with you as a therapist and they're suffering and they're checking you out, and they want to know, can you help? And are you skilled? And are you experienced? And do you understand? They are investing time and money and vulnerability to be with you. And so there can be a subtle pressure to demonstrate or perform or produce something. And I just noticed gradually over the years, that fell away as there was a realization that none of that helped the actual process. There's an intelligence within each of us, and given enough support and space, it will start to show itself and move very naturally. There's a natural movement of growth, I would say, both healing and of awakening. The other thing is there's just been a very open-ended deepening of sensitivity on my part. I find I can track people really easily and deeply, and that subtlety of perception has just continued to unfold.
What advice would you give to people who are kind of just starting out on their journey? So in the first few years, things that they might be able to think about.
I think the most important factor is our own vulnerability and authenticity. Much less important is mastering a particular system. Definitely an understanding of human nature is helpful, various patterns of conditioning. There are definitely useful methods, that one can learn and utilize. All of that to me is secondary, not the most important thing. Most important thing is our own authenticity. And authenticity requires vulnerability, self-honesty. So our self-honesty, our vulnerability, our authenticity are foundational in this work because it leads to our own self-intimacy and intimacy with the whole of life, and thus intimacy with everyone that we work with. And that is very much an inside process, like our love of truth, not as some philosophic ideal, but the living truth of our experience, our willingness to be rigorously honest and curious about our experience and to track it to its depths and its source. So that would be, I think, the most important thing.
It was one of the things that I took away from my first year, which was the foundation year. And that was this idea that it's not so much about what you learn, but about who you're becoming.
Yes. And who you're becoming and who you are, fundamentally.
And that was a really nice discovery and takeaway, because it's not really something that I considered before starting the training. I thought it would be important, but I now consider it also to be primary.
It's critically important.
What would you say your vision is for the future of psychotherapy?
Well, psychotherapy is, a very complex field because there are so many different orientations within a larger context socially as well. And so what we're seeing is it's more and more solution-oriented, symptomatic relief-oriented, and that needing to be documented, in order to be reimbursed. So if you're getting into that whole system, of whatever corporate or governmental supported psychotherapy and all the paperwork and diagnoses and treatments and justifications that goes with it. That's a whole field in itself. And it's becoming more and more kind of concrete, specific, results oriented. There's a certain value to that, of course, and one can understand for economic reasons why that's happening. Then there's private practice, and that also differentiates into different schools and orientations, all of which will continue to mature and synthesize and develop. Then there's a specific orientation that you're interested in, that I've been interested in, which is really including one's essential nature in that exploration. So it becomes more transpersonal, existential. What I see developing is more and more understanding of the themes that we talked about. In other words, the non-separation of the human from the essential, the importance of valuing both, understanding their interaction with one another between healing and awakening, how subtle and complex that is, in that sort of dialectic we were talking about earlier between psychology and spirituality. There'll be a further synthesis of understanding among contemplative psychotherapists and spiritual teachers who have some psychological understanding. And so there'll be cross referrals happening between contemplative psychotherapists and spiritual teachers and contemplative psychotherapists. My hope is that would continue to develop as we understand the confluence of these domains, and we do gain in that maturity.
Well, I can definitely see the broad arc towards a greater understanding of these ideas. You think about the advance of concepts like, well, firstly, yoga entering the Western world, and then mindfulness. And even in the last 15 years, when I first discovered non-duality, which would have been 2010, there was very little online that I could look at, access any resources. It was pretty much just reading. There's a couple of channels active. There was one called Never Not Here, and I watched a ton of videos on that. But otherwise, in terms of meetings and everything, it was quite slim pickings. But now, if you go on YouTube, there are tons of channels about non-duality. And in terms of it kind of pervading the culture, I see it going that way. And I do see, if I think about myself anyway, when I was selecting a therapist to work with during my training, I wanted them to understand these things. And I would think that if spiritual life becomes an important part of who you are, then you would want to have a therapist who was accommodating of that side of you. And so I would expect that more and more it will have an even greater place in the field.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's reasonable to expect.
So just to finish off, I sent you this question before, but I was wondering if you could share a story as a kind of blessing to leave us with.
I might leave people with a question, which is, do you really want to know what's true? And to be honest with that question, because very often we're ambivalent, and to find a yes, and if there's a no, be interested in the no. Be interested in that which maybe fears knowing who we really are, and to lean into that, be curious about that.
And if the answer is yes?
And if the answer is yes, to trust that and to give yourself to that. And that will be your guiding light. That will see you through your conditioning and on your quest, because your love for the truth comes from the truth of who you are. It's a kind of call and response. And your love of the truth will lead you home.